Forgotten giants. In the soft twilight of antiquity, some names stand tall and resplendent. Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Rome. They shine like stars across history's dark expanse. Yet, among them once stood another titan, a kingdom that rose with equal might, then slipped so quietly into silence that centuries forgot it ever existed. This was the Hittite Empire, a Bronze Age superpower, born in the highlands of Anatolia and at its peak commanding vast swathes of the Near East. For 300 years it contended with Egypt, Assyria and Babylon for supremacy, but when the dust settled, its monuments crumbled, its stories vanished, and its very name dissolved into whispers. For millennia, the Hittites were ghosts, unwritten, unspoken, unremembered. Imagine a child learning history in the old universities of Europe in the 1700s. They would trace dynasties of pharaohs, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and the myths of Homer. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, would they find mention of the Hittites. The Bible, curiously, named them in passing, a people inhabiting the lands of Canaan. Scholars puzzled over this. Were they minor hill tribes? A biblical exaggeration? Few imagined they had once stood as equals to Ramses the Great. It was as if all memory of their greatness had been deliberately erased. And so, when early travellers wandered the rugged Anatolian plateau and saw massive stones etched with unfamiliar hieroglyphs, they thought them relics of some local curiosity, not fragments of a vanished empire. Even as the 19th century dawned, archaeologists unearthed countless ancient cultures, Assyrians, Sumerians, even forgotten cities like Troy. Yet the Hittites remained hidden, almost teasing the scholarly world with their absence. What makes this erasure so striking is scale. At its zenith around the 13th century BCE, the Hittite realm stretched from western Anatolia across Syria, rushing against the Euphrates and challenging Egypt in the Levant. Its armies were vast, its bureaucracy intricate, its diplomacy sophisticated. They pioneered military chariots, codified laws, and sealed the earliest known peace treaty. And yet, despite all this, their memory was obliterated so completely that even educated men of the Enlightenment doubted they ever existed. Scholars still debate whether this was mere chance, ruins buried, texts lost, no successor to sing their praises, or whether rival powers had reasons to suppress their memory. One quirky twist: in Ottoman Anatolia, shepherds casually led their flocks across ancient citadel walls that had once guarded the Hittite capital. They stacked household goods against stones that, thousands of years earlier, had formed the gates of a world empire. Daily life unfolded literally atop the bones of forgotten giants. We might think of history as a straight line, a neat succession of empires rising and falling, but the Hittites remind us it is also a sieve through which entire civilizations can slip. And so our story begins not with their triumph, but with their silence, a silence so deep that for nearly 3,000 years their name was erased from the human record. First, rediscovery. The year was 1812, and a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, better remembered today for stumbling upon Petra, stood before strange stone reliefs in northern Syria. Carved figures with large eyes and unusual headgear lined the ancient site of Hamath. They bore no resemblance to Egyptian hieroglyphs, nor to Mesopotamian cuneiform. Burckhardt copied them carefully into his notes, puzzled. What people had left such enigmatic markings? He had no answer. The world did not yet have the concept of the Hittites as an empire, only faint biblical references to Hittites in the land of Canaan. To most scholars, they were little more than shadows. Over the next decades, European explorers and missionaries stumbled upon more of these peculiar inscriptions scattered across Anatolia and Syria. Each find deepened the mystery. Inscriptions at Aleppo, colossal lion statues at Ain Dara, and above all, the weather-worn carvings at Yazılıkaya near Boğazköy suggested the work of a once great culture. But who? The style was too foreign to be Greek, too distinct from Assyrian, too advanced to be dismissed as tribal art. By the mid-19th century, the riddle began to tantalize European scholars. Some speculated a lost branch of Phoenicians. Others proposed Trojans or even a breakaway Egyptian sect. Still others imagined an unknown Anatolian nation with no historical record. The inscriptions were dubbed hieroglyphic Hittite, long before the true scope of the civilization was understood. But naming did not mean knowing. For almost half a century, scholars peered at the strange symbols without making sense of them. And then came the moment of revelation. In the 1830s, a French archaeologist named Charles Texier trekked into the Anatolian interior. Near the modest village of Boğazköy, he stumbled upon massive city ruins sprawling across the landscape, walls kilomet, ears long, monumental gates, sculpted lions, and sanctuaries carved into stone. He recognized at once the scale. This was no mere provincial site, but the capital of a forgotten kingdom. Still without texts, without a name, the ruins remained mute. A quirky twist colours this rediscovery. Local villagers had long known the ruins simply as the stones. They used some blocks as foundations for homes and barns, treating them as convenient leftovers of some ancient builders. For them, the idea that European scholars were hailing the ruins as the seat of a mighty Bronze Age empire seemed almost absurd. As the 19th century rolled into the 20th, the puzzle grew. Scholars still debate whether the earliest finds, those scattered inscriptions, were recognized for their true significance at the time, or dismissed as oddities until the grander excavations began. What is clear is that, piece by piece, the silence that had hidden the Hittites for 3 millennia was beginning to crack. And so, the rediscovery began not with trumpets, but with whispers, forgotten inscriptions, misunderstood stones, and travellers scribbling copies of signs they could not yet read. Only later would the world realise that these fragments were not local curiosities, but clues to one of the great powers of the ancient world. Unearthing empire. By the dawn of the 20th century, the tantalizing whispers of the Hittites demanded something more than casual sketches and travellers' journals. In 1906, a German expedition under Hugo Winkler arrived at Boğazköy, the very site Charles Texier had first stumbled across 70 years earlier. Their goal was simple: to excavate systematically and prove whether these colossal ruins once belonged to a forgotten civilization. What they found would change the map of ancient history. As spades bit into Anatolia's soil, walls emerged, miles of fortifications winding across rocky hills, punctuated by massive stone gates adorned with lions, sphinxes, and warriors. This was no small town, this was a capital. The site soon yielded its true name, Hattusa. It had been the beating heart of an empire stretching from the Aegean coast to northern Syria. Its citadel towers, sprawling temples, and palatial archives revealed a state of breathtaking complexity. The breakthrough came with clay tablets. Thousands of them. Inscribed in cuneiform, they filled the storerooms of the ancient city like dusty libraries waiting to be read. Some carried laws, others diplomatic letters, still others myths and rituals. Among them was correspondence with kings of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, equal to equal. This was the smoking gun. These were not mere hill tribes. They were a world power. The long-forgotten Hittite Empire had finally spoken. One quirky note: locals at first thought the excavators were treasure hunters, baffled why Europeans fussed over broken bits of clay. Children even played games with discarded fragments, skipping them like stones across streams. They could hardly imagine those same tablets would rewrite world history. Winkler himself was struck by the scale of bureaucracy. The Hittites had catalogued everything: contracts for sheep, treaties with vassals, inventor, ease of gods. Here was an empire with paperwork rivaling modern ministries. And yet, scholars still debate whether Hattusa was chosen for its defensible highland terrain or its symbolic position at the heart of the Anatolian plateau. Was it a pragmatic choice or a sacred one? Perhaps the most evocative find was the city's sacred sanctuary at Yazılıkaya, a natural rock outcrop adorned with processions of carved gods. Here, long lines of divine figures march across the stone, each carefully labelled. To stand among them is to feel the pulse of a society where religion, kingship, and daily life merged into one. Archaeology is often compared to listening for faint echoes. At Hattusa, those echoes grew into a chorus. The gates spoke of power, the tablets of governance, the sanctuaries of belief. For the first time in 3 millennia, the Hittites were no longer shadows in scripture. They were a people of flesh and blood, clay and stone, empire and ambition. And yet, what made this revelation most extraordinary was not only what was uncovered, but what had been lost. An empire so vast, so organized, so intertwined with the great powers of its age had been utterly erased from collective memory, leaving behind only broken stones. To dig into Hattusa was to awaken a sleeping giant. Mysterious origins. Long before the great walls of Hattusa rose, the Anatolian plateau was a crossroads of wandering peoples. Archaeology shows us small farming villages dotting the hills around 2500 BCE, their pottery plain, their tools humble. But by the early 2nd millennium, new voices began to echo across the region, languages that bore uncanny resemblance to the roots of Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. These were the Indo-European migrants, drifting out of the northern steppes and settling among Anatolia's ancient peoples. Out of this mingling came the culture we would come to call Hittite. The earliest Hittite king we can name is Anitta, a warlord who carved his mark around 1700 BCE. His capital at Kadesh yielded tablets describing his conquests, boasting that he cursed the ruins of Hattusa so thoroughly that no king should ever rebuild them. Ironically, generations later, his successors would make Hattusa the very heart of their empire. Scholars still debate whether these Indo-European newcomers arrived peacefully, blending with locals, or through waves of conquest. The truth may lie somewhere between, an interweaving of migration, alliance, and absorption. From the start, the Hittites were a fusion people. Their gods were adopted from older Anatolian cults, their scripts from Mesopotamian scribes, their architecture borrowing both native and foreign styles. This patchwork heritage became their strength, an empire flexible, adaptable, and willing to absorb rather than erase. But it also makes tracing their origins maddeningly elusive. Were they invaders, opportunists, or simply neighbours who rose to power? A quirky fragment of their origin story survives in myth. The Song of Kamabi, preserved on clay tablets, tells of a succession of storm gods overthrowing one another, echoing Greek tales of Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus. Did the Greeks borrow from the Hittites, or both from older Mesopotamian traditions? Scholars still debate whether such myths hint at a shared cultural ancestry stretching across the Indo-European world, or whether they are simply stories that happen to rhyme across civilizations. The early kings who consolidated Hittite power were not only warriors, but shrewd diplomats. They forged alliances with local lords, married into rival families, and expanded cautiously. By the time Hattusili rose around 1650 BCE, the Hittites had already carved a niche as a formidable regional force. His campaigns reached deep into Syria, brushing the borders of Babylon. The name Hatti, originally belonging to an older Anatolian people, was adopted by these new rulers as a mantle of legitimacy, another layer in their hybrid identity. And so the Hittites emerged not from a single spark, but from a long, slow weaving of threads. Indo-European language, Anatolian soil, Mesopotamian influence. Their origins remain misty, like mountains glimpsed at dawn. But from those uncertain beginnings would rise a kingdom powerful enough to challenge the mightiest empires of its age, and yet fragile enough to vanish without trace. Kings and laws. The Hittite throne was not merely a seat of power, it was a sacred institution, wrapped in ritual and tempered by pragmatism. Each king of Hatti bore the title "My Son," a reflection of divine radiance. Yet, unlike the pharaohs of Egypt, Hittite rulers did not claim godhood. They were mortals entrusted with the god's mandate, bound by duty rather than worshipped outright. This distinction reveals something striking. The Hittite monarchy was powerful, yes, but it was also hemmed in by custom, council, and law. Take Telepinu, a king around 1525 BCE. His reign was scarred by palace intrigue and bloody coups. In response, he issued the Edict of Telepinu, one of the most remarkable legal texts of the Bronze Age. It codified succession rules, condemning the chaos of assassinations and fratricide, and outlined a clear line of inheritance. It also emphasized fairness in land disputes and punishments, reflecting a society deeply concerned with stability. Scholars still debate whether the edict was truly effective or merely aspirational, but its very existence suggests a kingdom striving to restrain absolute power. Hittite law codes, preserved on clay tablets, paint a picture of a surprisingly pragmatic society. Unlike the harsh eye for an eye of Hammurabi's Babylon, Hittite justice often substituted fines or compensation for bodily injury. Break someone's arm, pay them, damage their ox, repay double. Only in severe crimes, treason, sorcery, or certain sexual offences, was execution prescribed. The laws reveal a state that valued restitution over retribution, more interested in keeping the peace than in spilling blood. A quirky detail in these laws captures the imagination. Sorcery was not only punishable, but obsessively documented. Rituals of cleansing, spells of undoing, incantations against curses, all were recorded alongside legal penalties. In Hittite Thou, Ait, the unseen world of magic was woven directly into the legal framework of the state. Yet the king was not a lone lawgiver. He was surrounded by a council of nobles and military leaders who could advise, challenge, and even curb his actions. Queens too played prominent roles, a fact that set Hittite society apart from many contemporaries. The royal household was both palace and parliament, a place where power was shared uneasily between bloodlines, factions, and even genders. But behind this balance of law and ritual lurked constant danger. Palatial murders, betrayals, and usurpations punctuate Hittite annals. Kings were revered, but they were also mortal targets. This duality, divinely sanctioned yet precariously mortal, shaped the very character of the empire. Scholars still debate whether the Hittite monarchy should be seen as a proto-constitutional system or simply another autocracy constrained by circumstance. Imagine the throne room at Hattusa, the king seated beneath golden emblems of the sun god, advisors arrayed at his side, clay tablets of law stacked on shelves nearby. Here was a ruler both supreme and bound, feared and vulnerable, mortal yet luminous. In the interplay of crown and code, the Hittites carved out their distinctive form of kingship, one that would guide their empire through both triumphs and trials. Chariots of war. If law and ritual formed the bones of the Hittite state, then war was its muscle, and at the heart of Hittite warfare rolled their greatest innovation, the chariot. Long before knights thundered across medieval battlefields, the Hittites were harnessing horse and wheel into a machine that redefined combat. Archaeological evidence suggests the Hittites perfected a unique design. Whereas Egyptian chariots were light and swift, carrying 2 men, a driver and an archer, the Hittite version was heavier, sturdier, built to carry 3, driver, shield-bearer, and spearman. This allowed them to form shock units, battering through enemy lines with sheer force. The innovation made the Hittite chariot less nimble, but devastatingly effective in massed formations. Scholars still debate whether these vehicles were more like mobile platforms or charging tanks, but on the battlefield, their impact was undeniable. We have glimpses of these armies in texts and reliefs. Kings boast of campaigns stretching from western Anatolia to the gates of Babylon. The annals of Suppiluliuma I, one of the greatest Hittite rulers, recount whirlwind campaigns across Syria, seizing city after city. Behind these victories, the chariots roared, wood, leather, and bronze grinding together in disciplined rhythm. A quirky discovery adds texture to this story. At the site of Puduhepa, a tablet describes meticulous records of horse training, feeding schedules, exercise routines, even instructions for grooming. Far from being mere beasts of burden, the horses of the Hittite army were treated almost like elite athletes, their performance central to the empire's power. The so-called Kikuli text, attributed to a master trainer, lays out a 184-day program for conditioning war horses, arguably the world's earliest manual on equestrian science. Yet the chariot was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of royal authority. Kings and princes appeared in processions mounted upon them, echoing their divine right to command. To ride in a chariot was to embody the storm god himself, thundering across the earth. Still, the supremacy of the chariot was fragile. Terrain limited its use. Rocky ground or marshes could reduce these fearsome machines to lumbering burdens. Scholars still debate whether the Hittites were over-reliant on them, making their armies vulnerable in unfavourable conditions. At times, their enemies learned to lure the heavy Hittite chariots into traps where mobility failed. Picture it, though, a Bronze Age battlefield, the air thick with dust and cries. Egyptian archers loose volleys, but the horizon darkens as Hittite chariots surge forward, wheels pounding, spears gleaming. In that moment, war itself had evolved. For the Hittites, the chariot was not merely a tool, it was the engine of empire, carrying them to glory and, in time, into collision with the greatest rival of all, the Egyptian clash. It was the year 1274 BCE, and the plains of Kadesh in Syria became the stage for one of the most legendary battles of the ancient world. Two superpowers stood poised against one another, Egypt under Ramses II, the so-called Great, and the Hittite Empire under Mu'tali II. Never before had two armies of such size and sophistication clashed head-on, and never again in the Bronze Age would a battle of this scale be recorded with such detail. The Egyptians arrived first, confident in their strength. Ramses, leading his divisions northward, believed he faced only a small enemy contingent, but the Hittites had planned a trap. From behind the city walls of Kadesh, thousands of their chariots, some accounts claim 3,500, thundered forth in a surprise assault. The Egyptian vanguard was crushed, scattered like leaves before a storm. Ramses himself barely escaped, rallying his men in what Egyptian inscriptions later glorified as his heroic stand. Reliefs at Abu Simbel depict him charging alone into a sea of foes, divinely aided, his bow cutting down enemies by the score. The truth, as the Hittite records reveal, was far less one-sided. Reinforcements arrived, and the battle devolved into a stalemate. Both sides claimed victory. In reality, neither could decisively break the other. A quirky detail emerges from the Egyptian version of events. Among the reliefs, Hittite charioteers are shown tumbling dramatically from their vehicles, horses overturned in chaos. To the Egyptian artists, the battle was pure propaganda, their pharaoh invincible. Yet we know from surviving Hittite accounts that Ramses' army was nearly annihilated in those opening charges. Scholars still debate whether the Egyptian king's victory was little more than skillful spin, a masterclass in ancient public relations. What is certain is that Kadesh marked a turning point. Never again would Egypt or the Hittites attempt outright conquest of the other's heartland. The Levant, that narrow strip of contested cities and trade routes, became the permanent borderland where their empires rubbed shoulders uneasily. The battle also offers us a window into Bronze Age diplomacy. In the aftermath, envoys shuttled between Hattusa and Thebes, each side wary of renewed conflict. Eventually, decades later, the first recorded peace treaty in history would be signed between Ramses and the Hittites, a tablet still preserved today in the United Nations headquarters as a symbol of mankind's oldest pursuit of peace. But standing in that moment at Kadesh, as dust hung heavy over broken chariots and slain soldiers, one senses the precarious balance of power. Two empires, equally matched, had collided with thunderous force, and neither could truly claim supremacy. It was a clash that cemented the Hittites as equals to Egypt, even as it foreshadowed the fragility of their future. Diplomatic firsts. Out of the smoke of Kadesh, something unexpected emerged, not renewed war, but diplomacy. By the middle of the 13th century BCE, Egypt and the Hittites realized that endless conflict drained both their strength. And so, after years of uneasy skirmishes and shifting borders, the rulers of the two great empires agreed on something radical for their time: peace written into law. The treaty between Ramses II of Egypt and Hattusa III of the Hittites, signed around 1259 BCE, is often called the earliest surviving international peace treaty. Unlike so many fragile oaths in antiquity, this one was carved into clay and stone, ensuring its permanence. The agreement called for mutual non-aggression, military alliance in times of invasion, and even extradition of fugitives. It was, in essence, the framework of modern diplomacy, written 3,000 years before the United Nations. A remarkable copy of this treaty survives today in both hieroglyphic Egyptian and Akkadian cuneiform Hittite versions. One hangs in replica at the UN headquarters in New York, a reminder that even in the violent churn of the Bronze Age, people reached for peace. Scholars still debate whether the treaty was truly one of equals. Egyptian sources, predictably, present Ramses as the magnanimous victor, while Hittite records suggest parity. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. Beyond treaties, the Hittites were masters of the subtler arts of diplomacy. Their archives at Hattusa contain letters to and from rulers of Babylon, Assyria, and even the distant kings of Mycenaean Greece. These documents reveal negotiations over marriages, trade, and alliances. A famous example is the correspondence between the widowed Queen of Egypt, Ankhesenamun, and the Hittite court. After the death of Tutankhamun, she begged the Hittite king to send one of his sons to marry her, promising his the throne of Egypt. It was a stunning proposal, hinting at how entangled the great courts of the Bronze Age had become. The son was dispatched, but assassinated before reaching Egypt, a reminder of how fragile such gambits could be. Quirky details of diplomacy survive in these letters: gifts of fine linen, golden statues of gods, horses, lapis lazuli, even recipes for medical cures exchanged between courts. These were not merely transactions of power, but glimpses of shared human culture across empires. The Hittites also pioneered the use of vassal treaties. Conquered states from Syria to Anatolia signed detailed agreements swearing loyalty, often sealed with elaborate oaths invoking gods and curses. Break the treaty and divine wrath, not just Hittite armies, was expected to fall upon you. Such documents foreshadowed later empires' systems of provinces and satrapies. In the end, it was not only their chariots or fortresses that secured the Hittite realm, but their ability to navigate the delicate chessboard of international politics. Through treaties, marriages, and carefully worded correspondence, they stitched together a network of allies and subjects that held their empire together for centuries. And in that bold parchment of peace with Egypt, the Hittites left a legacy not of war, but of the world's first durable handshake between rival superpowers, gods of stone. If diplomacy revealed the Hittites' pragmatism, their sanctuaries revealed their soul. Scattered across Anatolia, carved into cliffs and mountainsides, the gods of the Hittites still linger, etched in stone as if to outlast the silence that swallowed their empire. The most haunting of these places lies just outside Hattusa at Yazılıkaya, a natural rock sanctuary that became a temple of eternal procession. Here, on weathered limestone walls, long lines of deities march in orderly ranks. The storm god Teshub, the sun goddess Hepat, the moon god, and a host of lesser spirits stride toward one another, two processions converging in a cosmic meeting. Each figure is labelled, their attributes carefully carved: tall hats, curved swords, flowing robes. To stand before them, even today, is to feel the presence of an entire pantheon frozen in mid-ceremony. The Hittites were sometimes called the people of 1,000 gods, and the title is not an exaggeration. They practiced what modern scholars describe as religious inclusivity. Every conquered city brought its gods with it, and rather than erase them, the Hittites simply adopted them. By the empire's height, their pantheon numbered in the hundreds, a dizzying fusion of Anatolian, Mesopotamian, and Hurrian deities. Scholars still debate whether this was a theological principle of tolerance or simply a political strategy. After all, honouring local gods meant honouring local loyalties. Quirky rituals accompanied these stone deities. Texts describe elaborate festivals where statues of gods were carried in procession through the streets of Hattusa, fed with offerings of bread, beer, and honey. Some ceremonies involved symbolic battles between priests dressed as gods, reenacting myths of storm and chaos. Others invoked purification by driving out evil with effigies or even live animals. To the Hittites, the boundary between divine myth and civic duty was porous. Ritual was governance, and governance was ritual. Yazılıkaya itself may have been more than a sanctuary. Some archaeologists argue it was a cosmic calendar, its processions marking the cycles of months or seasons. Others see it as a theatre of initiation for kings, where rulers stood among the gods to legitimize their reign. Scholars still debate whether its carvings were intended as a public spectacle or a hidden liturgy for the priesthood. What is undeniable is the artistry. The gods stride in profile, their bodies stiff yet elegant, their faces stoic. Unlike the monumental statues of Egypt or the colossal bulls of Assyria, the Hittite style was subtler, more linear, almost whispering rather than shouting. Their gods were everywhere, in reliefs carved into mountains, in seals pressed into clay, in miniature figurines tucked into tombs. Imagine a Hittite standing before the sacred outcrop, the cool limestone under torchlight, chanting prayers as the carved gods glowed in flickering flame. These were not lifeless stones, they were thresholds, gateways through which the divine stepped into human space. And in preserving their likeness in rock, the Hittites ensured that even when their empire crumbled, their gods would remain, silent yet enduring, guardians of a vanished world. Myths and rituals. If the gods of Yazılıkaya stood in solemn procession upon stone, their voices lived in clay. Across the archives of Hattusa, scribes recorded myth after myth, prayer after prayer, ritual after ritual, fragments of a spiritual world that feels at once alien and familiar. Through these tablets, we glimpse the inner life of the Hittites, how they explained thunder, why they feared famine, and the stories they told as night fell over their citadels. Foremost among their tales was the myth of the storm god and the dragon Ilyanka. In this story, the mighty storm god Teshub battled the serpent Ilyanka, who defeated him in their first encounter. With the help of a mortal, the god later tricked the serpent and struck him down, restoring cosmic order. To the Hittites, this was not just a tale of monsters, it was a ritual drama reenacted at festivals, a reminder that chaos always threatened and must always be defeated anew. Scholars still debate whether this myth influenced later legends, from the Babylonian Tiamat to the Greek Python slain by Apollo. Another captivating cycle was the Song of Kumarbi, recounting a divine succession of power among the gods. In its pages, Kumarbi bites off the genitals of the sky god Anu, becoming pregnant with the storm god Teshub. This raw and unsettling imagery echoes strikingly with Greek myths of Kronos and Zeus. Was there direct borrowing, or are these parallel echoes of a shared Indo-European tradition? The jury remains divided. Beyond myth, the Hittite tablets detail rituals of astonishing variety. Some called for animal sacrifice, oxen, sheep, goats offered to the gods. Others involved symbolic acts, bread moulded into shapes, figurines representing evil burned or cast into rivers. One quirky ritual prescribed leading a goat through the royal palace to absorb its impurities before sending it into the wild, an ancient, not parallel to the later Hebrew idea of the scapegoat. Magic, too, was woven into the fabric of worship. Healing incantations involved herbs, chants, and sometimes the binding of illnesses into clay figurines. Protective spells invoked divine guardians against curses or hostile sorcery. Scholars still debate how much of this magic was truly religious belief versus a practical medicine cloaked in ritual, but to the Hittites there was no distinction. Festivals punctuated the year, uniting the realm. The Puruli festival in spring reenacted the storm god's victory over Ilyanka, ensuring fertility and abundance. The Kai Lam festival celebrated renewal, with processions of god statues through city streets, feasting and music. Through such rituals, the empire bound together its diverse peoples under a shared rhythm of divine drama. And always, at the centre, stood the king and queen. They were the chief officiants, the ones who prayed, offered, and mediated between heaven and earth. To rule the Hittites was not merely to govern armies and laws, it was to keep the cosmos in balance, to perform the rituals that kept chaos at bay. So the myths were not idle stories, nor the rituals quaint superstitions. They were the scaffolding of life itself. Through them, the Hittites sought to make sense of a world both fragile and vast, where gods thundered in the sky and dragons slithered beneath the earth. And in whispering their tales into clay, they left behind a chorus that still murmurs across 3,000 years. Everyday lives. Empires are often remembered through their kings, their wars, and their treaties. Yet beneath the walls of Hattusa, in villages scattered across Anatolia and Syria, it was ordinary men and women who sustained the Hittite world. Their hands ploughed fields, baked bread, tended animals, and copied tablets. Without them, the storm god's festivals would have gone uncelebrated, the chariots unfed, and the empire itself unmade. Agriculture formed the backbone of daily life. Fields of barley, wheat, and lentils stretched across the plateau, watered by streams and fed by patient labour. Farmers ploughed with wooden tools tipped in bronze, their oxen trudging slowly under the Anatolian sun. The rhythm of planting and harvest dictated the year, punctuated by festivals that asked the gods for fertility and protection against drought. One quirky detail survives in ritual texts. Farmers sometimes buried small clay figurines of grain beneath the soil as offerings, little tokens of hope for abundance. Life in the towns was a patchwork of trade and craft. Marketplaces bustled with merchants hawking wool, leather goods, bronze tools and pottery. Hittite artisans were especially skilled at seal carving. Tiny stamp seals, often decorated with lions, bulls or winged creatures, acted as signatures on contracts and shipments. Scholars still debate whether these seals were purely practical or also carried protective, magical weight for their owners. Women's roles were not confined to the hearth. They brewed beer, managed households, and worked in textile workshops. Some served as priestesses, others as scribes. Texts even reveal women participating in property transactions, suggesting a degree of legal autonomy unusual in the Bronze Age. At the very top, queens like Puduhepa wielded extraordinary influence, but even in villages, women's labour and voices shaped the texture of society. Children too left their faint imprint. In Hattusa's ruins, archaeologists found toys, clay animals with rolling wheels, small rattles, and figurines likely used in games. It is a reminder that even amid empires and treaties, children laughed, played, and dreamed beneath the shadow of stone walls. Scribes occupied a special niche, their reed styluses pressing signs into wet clay. They were the keepers of memory, copying myths, laws, and correspondence. Quirky fragments of everyday bureaucracy survive. Lists of livestock, notes on rations, even instructions for delivering bread to the palace kitchens. To leaf through these tablets is to glimpse the ordinary hum of empire, not in battles, but in barley and bread. Daily life was also shadowed by vulnerability. Famine struck often when drought or pests ruined crops. Disease crept through crowded towns. Scholars still debate whether the Hittite plateau's harsh winters strained the population more than enemy armies ever did. Archaeological evidence suggests granaries and storage pits were crucial defences against such calamities. Imagine an evening in a Hittite village, smoke rising from clay hearths, goats bleating in pens, children chasing wheeled toys, while elders gather to tell tales of the storm god. Beyond the horizon, kings plot wars and scribes draft treaties, but here, in the glow of firelight, the empire lives in its truest form, woven from the ordinary lives of its people. The royal women, among the stone tablets of Hattusa, a striking figure emerges, the queen. In most Bronze Age kingdoms, royal women are shadows, footnotes in annals of kings and generals. But in Hittite society, queens, known as tawananas, were not only consorts but partners in rule. Their names appear on treaties, their seals on documents, their voices woven into the fabric of empire. One of the most remarkable was Puduhepa, queen alongside Hattusili III in the 13th century BCE. A daughter of a priest from the city of Kidzuwatna, she rose from sacred service to stand beside the king in governance. Her correspondence survives, letters to the pharaoh Ramses II, warm yet commanding, addressing him as an equal. When the famous peace treaty was signed, Puduhepa affixed her own seal beside her husband's, a gesture almost unthinkable in most ancient courts. Scholars still debate whether her prominence reflected unique personal strength or a broader tradition of empowered queenship in Hittite culture. The Tawananna was not a ceremonial title. She presided over cult rituals, managed temple estates, and served as intercessor with the gods. In times of transition, the queen retained her office for life, even after her husband's death, sometimes clashing with incoming rulers. This continuity gave royal women unusual influence, anchoring dynastic stability across turbulent reigns. A quirky glimpse of their authority comes from legal texts. Queens could own property, grant land, and even command workforces. In one case, a tablet records Puduhepa reorganizing temples and reallocating priestly duties, hardly the work of a silent consort. She was, in essence, co-sovereign, her reach extending from the palace into the divine sphere. But royal women were not immune to intrigue. Letters hint at bitter rivalries between reigning queens and ambitious younger wives. In one infamous episode, Telepinu's succession edict emerged from violent struggles within the palace, where queens and princesses were both victims and players in plots that toppled kings. Scholars still debate how much of this was systemic, were women always so politically central, or whether the surviving records exaggerate the drama of exceptional moments. Even in the myths, echoes of female authority resonate. Goddesses like Hepat, sun-mother of Arinna, occupied exalted positions equal to their male counterparts. Ritual texts show priestesses officiating alongside male priests, binding the sacred and the political together. In this interplay, queens became living extensions of divine order, their authority rooted not only in dynasty but in cosmic balance. Imagine Puduhepa seated in her court, a queen writing to foreign kings, reorganizing priesthoods, and guiding festivals while envoys await her decisions. She is regal yet pragmatic, shaping the destiny of an empire with both pen and prayer. In a world where pharaohs demanded worship and Mesopotamian kings claimed divine favor, the Hittites carved a different path, one where royal women stood visibly at the center of power, not behind it. Their story reminds us that empires are not only shaped by warriors and kings, but also by queens who wielded their voices like scepters, steadying the throne amid storm and strife. Letters from abroad. Deep within the archives of Hattusa, nestled among myths and laws, lie clay tablets that carry voices from far beyond Anatolia. These are the diplomatic letters of the Hittite kings, carefully inscribed in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the Bronze Age world. They reveal a civilization not isolated, but woven into a vast tapestry of alliances, rivalries, and exchanges that stretched from the Nile to the Aegean. One of the most famous finds is the Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt. Among correspondence between the pharaohs and their neighbours are appeals and negotiations with the Hittite court. These letters speak of dowries, military support, and gifts exchanged between rulers who styled each other as brothers, a term signalling equality among great kings. To read them is to step into a diplomatic club of monarchs, where egos were as fragile as armies. Perhaps the most dramatic episode comes after the sudden death of Tutankhamun. His widowed queen, Ankhesenamun, desperate to secure Egypt's throne, wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I. Her plea is extraordinary. "Send me one of your sons, and he shall be my husband. I will not take a servant as my lord." For a queen of Egypt to invite a foreign prince onto the throne was unprecedented. Suppiluliuma hesitated, suspicious of a trap, but eventually sent his son Zananza. The story ends in blood. Zananza was murdered en route, likely by Egyptian factions unwilling to see a Hittite king in Thebes. The letters preserve the shock of this aborted union, a moment when the destinies of two empires nearly intertwined. Quirky details emerge in other correspondence. Kings complained when promised gifts failed to arrive, horses not delivered, gold statues lighter than expected, or fine linen that never reached the palace. In one case, a Babylonian ruler grumbled that his Hittite counterpart had sent a wooden idol instead of a golden one. These were more than petty disputes. In a world where prestige mattered, gifts were political theatre. The Hittite archives also reveal regular contact with the distant Mycenaean Greeks. Though fragmentary, the tablets suggest recognition of Ahiawa, a land many identify with the Achaeans of Homeric fame. Scholars still debate the depth of this relationship. Were these Greeks mere trading partners, occasional foes, or true peers on the international stage? The correspondence hints at a Mediterranean world far more interconnected than once imagined. Beyond diplomacy, letters carried practical matters. Instructions to governors, reports from vassal states, updates on troop movements, all show the machinery of empire ticking across vast distances. The scribes of Hattusa must have worked tirelessly, copying tablets, dispatching couriers, filing replies. In their hands, the Hittites managed an empire stretched across mountains and seas. Picture one such courier, riding out from Hattusa with a clay tablet wrapped in linen, destined for Babylon or Egypt. Weeks or months later, A foreign king unrolled the packet, squinting at Akkadian signs pressed by a Hittite scribe. Across hundreds of miles, in brittle clay, the voice of one monarch reached another. These letters remind us that even in the Bronze Age, diplomacy travelled not just by sword and chariot, but by the fragile marks of a stylus in damp clay. Bronze Age web. The Hittite Empire did not stand alone. It was a knot in the great web of the late Bronze Age. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from Mycenaean Greece to Babylon and beyond, trade routes carried goods, ideas, and rivalries. To walk the streets of Hattusa was to stand at a crossroads of worlds where caravans rattled in with tin, copper, and lapis, and departed laden with textiles, silver, and horses. Bronze was the lifeblood of this network. To make it, copper had to be alloyed with tin, a metal rare and precious. Anatolia held copper in abundance, but tin was scarce. The Hittites relied on sprawling networks that reached into Afghanistan, Central Asia, and perhaps even further. Without tin, no bronze. Without bronze, no weapons, no tools, no empire. Scholars still debate the precise routes of this trade. Was tin shipped across Mesopotamia or carried in secret through Anatolian mountains? Whatever the path, the Hittites stood as gatekeepers of the metal that defined their age. Quirky evidence of these networks survives in unexpected places. At Kultepe, long before the empire's height, archaeologists uncovered thousands of Assyrian merchant tablets, contracts, shipping manifests, letters. These clay archives describe caravans trudging across Anatolia, carrying tin and textiles, leaving behind debt disputes and complaints about dishonest partners. They reveal a Bronze Age world buzzing with commercial energy, its deals and betrayals not so different from our own. The Hittites were also brokers of culture. They absorbed Mesopotamian myths, Hurrian rituals, and Anatolian deities, mixing them into their own traditions. They exported horses, famed for their strength, and perhaps even techniques of chariotry, influencing warfare far beyond their borders. Some scholars even suggest that the fabled Trojan War, remembered in Greek epic, unfolded on the very fringe of Hittite influence, a clash born of this interconnected Mediterranean world. But entanglement brought danger. When famine struck in Anatolia, the Hittite kings wrote desperate letters to Egypt and Babylon, begging for grain. Droughts or crop failures in one region could ripple through the web, shaking distant kingdoms. The empire's strength was also its fragility, dependent on faraway supplies, vulnerable to disruptions. Scholars still debate whether these interdependencies magnified the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse that swept the region in the 12th century BCE. Picture a Hittite port on the Mediterranean coast, perhaps at Ugarit. Ships creak at anchor, their holds stacked with copper ingots shaped like ox hides, amphorae filled with oil, timber lashed in bundles. Merchants bargain in Akkadian, scribes tally cargoes, priests bless the voyage. From these hubs, the world was stitched together, not by kings alone, but by sailors, traders, and scribes. The Hittites' role in this web was both commanding and precarious. They were lords of the plateau, but also middlemen, reliant on trade arteries flowing through lands they did not fully control. Their empire pulsed with the energy of exchange, a living reminder that no civilization thrives alone. And like any web, when one strand snapped, the whole structure trembled. Secret scripts. Among the most enduring puzzles of the Hittites lay in the very way they wrote. Two distinct systems carried their voices across the centuries: the borrowed strokes of Mesopotamian cuneiform and the peculiar hieroglyphic Hittite, a script of symbols carved into stone that baffled scholars for centuries. Each carried secrets, and together they reveal the breadth of Hittite ambition: administration on clay, proclamation on rock. Cuneiform was the workhorse of the empire. Thousands of tablets from Hattusa, testify to its use in laws, letters, treaties, and myths. Written in Akkadian for international diplomacy and in the Hittite tongue for domestic affairs, these tablets show a bureaucracy humming with scribes. Yet nestled among them are curiosities, bilingual glossaries, scribal exercises, even doodles. One quirky fragment preserves a scribe practicing signs over and over, like a schoolchild repeating alphabets. It is a rare, almost human moment in the midst of imperial paperwork. But it was the hieroglyphic script that long mystified modern eyes. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, these symbols were Anatolian in origin: deer heads, axes, spears, birds, hands, eyes. They appeared on seals, monumental inscriptions, and boundary stones. For decades, explorers copied them without understanding, convinced they belonged to some unknown tongue. Some even thought they were decorative rather than linguistic. Scholars still debate whether the script was reserved mainly for public display, royal monuments and proclamations, while cuneiform remained the tool of everyday governance. The hieroglyphs also hint at a desire for permanence. Clay tablets, easily broken or lost, served the day-to-day needs of administration, but stone, carved deep, proclaimed authority to gods and generations. To carve in hieroglyphs was to stake a claim on eternity, declaring, "We were here, Dec." Fearing these scripts was no easy feat. For cuneiform, the breakthrough came in the early 20th century, when linguists realized that the so-called language of the Hittite kings was, in fact, the earliest known Indo-European tongue. This discovery reshaped the history of language, proving that the Indo-European family stretched back into the Bronze Age. Scholars still debate exactly how Hittite fits into the Indo-European tree. Was it an offshoot, a sibling, or the trunk itself? The mystery lingers. The hieroglyphic script took longer. Only in the mid-20th century did researchers manage to crack its code, confirming it too rendered the Hittite-related Luwian language. Suddenly, the carved stones scattered across Anatolia spoke again, revealing royal lineages, victories, and prayers. Imagine the scribes at work. In one chamber, styluses tapping against wet clay, producing lines of compact cuneiform. In another, masons chiselling deer-headed symbols into stone under the Anatolian sun. Each medium carried its own weight, clay for the immediate, stone for the eternal. The Hittites left behind not one voice but two, the administrative hum of cuneiform and the monumental declarations of hieroglyphs. For millennia both lay silent, secrets locked in symbols. Their rediscovery was not just the resurrection of a language, but the unsealing of an empire's memory, hidden in scripts both fragile and enduring. Scholars' debates. The rediscovery of Hittite writing ignited not only excitement but also controversy, when in 1915 the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný announced that the language of the Hittite kings was Indo-European. Many scholars were incredulous. To claim that the tablets of Hattusa preserved the earliest known Indo-European tongue was audacious. Yet his translation of a simple line, "Now you will eat bread and drink water," proved the case beyond denial. It tied the Hittites not to Sumer or Egypt, but to the same linguistic family as Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. Still, questions remain. Scholars still debate whether Hittite was the earliest branch of Indo-European, preserving archaic features long since lost, or whether it split off before the family fully formed. Its vocabulary includes strange gaps. No native word for sea, for instance, suggesting a landlocked origin, while its grammar feels stripped down, missing the elaborate verb tenses of Greek or Sanskrit. Was this simplicity original, or the result of centuries of contact with neighbouring tongues? The jury is out. Beyond linguistics, debates swirl around identity. Were the Hittites truly Indo-European conquerors, as older theories suggested, sweeping into Anatolia with fire and chariots? Or were they a fusion of migrants and locals, a hybrid culture born of slow mingling? Archaeology paints a complex picture, Indo-European speech in Hittite texts, but art and religion steeped in older Anatolian and Hurrian traditions. Perhaps the empire's genius lay in absorbing influences rather than in imposing them. Quirky theories have also emerged. Some 20th century scholars, eager for drama, suggested that the Hittites were the lost tribes of Israel or survivors of Atlantis. Such notions have long since been dismissed, but they speak to the aura of mystery that surrounded this forgotten empire. Even today, from Xarm, English claims resurface, imagining Hittites as builders of Troy or ancestors of Celtic tribes. While lacking evidence, these ideas underscore how the Hittites still tantalize the imagination. Even the nature of their power is disputed. Some portray them as innovators, the first to develop large-scale chariot tactics, the first to codify international treaties, the first to experiment with federal-style vassal networks. Others argue they were borrowers, taking Mesopotamian bureaucracy, Hurrian myths, and Egyptian iconography and weaving them into their own. Scholars still debate, were the Hittites creative pioneers or consummate synthesizers? What is certain is that every tablet, every relief, forces us to rethink their place in the ancient world. A century ago, the Hittites were a biblical footnote. Today, they are recognized as equals to Egypt and Babylon. Yet the debates remain lively because their story is still incomplete. Entire archives await excavation. Entire scripts may hide beneath Anatolian soil. Picture a lecture hall, perhaps at the University of Berlin in 1915, as Hrozny first unveiled his discovery. His peers frowned, skeptics muttered, some dismissed him outright. And yet the clay itself did not lie. With patient study, the Hittites spoke again in words that echoed across Europe's oldest languages. From then on, debate has been their second life, scholars arguing not whether they existed, but what precisely they were. Storm over Syria. The fertile crescent of Syria was the prize every Bronze Age superpower desired. To the south, Egypt claimed it as its northern frontier. To the north, the Hittites viewed it as their natural sphere of influence. Between them lay a patchwork of city-states, Kadesh, Ugarit, Aleppo, each shifting allegiance depending on who seemed strongest that year. For centuries, this contested land became the storm front where Hittite ambition met Egyptian pride. One of the earliest campaigns into Syria was led by Hattusa in the 17th century BCE. His annals describe marching south, seizing cities, and even challenging mighty Babylon. Later, Superpower I in the 14th century BCE expanded deeper still, conquering Mitanni, a Hurrian kingdom that had long dominated northern Syria. Superpower's victories reshaped the balance of power. Egypt's grip on its northern vassals weakened, while Hatti's influence surged. But the Syrian frontier was never secure. Egypt counterattacked, forging alliances with rebellious cities. Treaties were signed and broken, cities besieged and retaken. The region became a perpetual chessboard. Scholars still debate whether these wars were fought mainly for prestige, for access to trade routes, or for the fertile farmlands that could feed empires. Likely it was all three. A quirky episode reveals the human drama behind these rivalries. After Superpower's Syrian campaigns, plague swept through the empire, possibly brought back by soldiers returning from the south. Tablets record the king lamenting the god's wrath, linking the epidemic to his wars. The disease carried off thousands, even the king himself. Thus, conquest in Syria may have won glory, but also unleashed catastrophe upon the homeland. The most famous clash, of course, came at Kadesh under Mu'talib II and Ramses II, a battle we have already traced. But even after the dust of Kadesh settled, Syria remained a zone of tension. Vassal states wrote frantic letters to both courts, pledging loyalty to whichever master seemed ascendant. often switching sides in mid-sentence. One can almost hear their desperation. Survival meant choosing the right patron at the right moment. The Hittites fortified their grip by installing governors and royal relatives in Syrian cities. They built garrisons, imposed treaties, and demanded tribute. Yet distance was their enemy. Hattusa lay hundreds of kilometers away, across mountains and deserts, while Egypt had the advantage of the Nile's smooth artery. Scholars still debate whether the Hittite Empire was overstretched in trying to hold Syria, its resources drained by constant defence of a land never fully secure. Imagine the bustling harbour of Ugarit, ships unloading timber, copper and luxury goods, scribes tallying tablets in Akkadian, envoys whispering news of shifting alliances. Above this hum of trade hovered the shadow of empire, Hittite or Egyptian, depending on the season. For the people of Syria, survival meant living beneath the storm, their fate tied to battles fought far beyond their walls. And so, in the struggle over Syria, the Hittites carved both their greatest triumphs and sowed seeds of future strain. For in chasing the Fertile Crescent, they tethered themselves to an endless storm. Fragile alliances. The strength of the Hittite Empire did not rest solely on its armies or its capital at Hattusa. It rested on a delicate network of vassal states, kingdoms and cities bound by treaties, oaths, and the constant shadow of imperial power. These alliances were the glue that held Hatti's wide dominion together, but they were also its greatest weakness. Across Anatolia and Syria, rulers swore loyalty to the Hittite king. Treaties survive on clay tablets, outlining obligations in meticulous detail, tribute of silver or grain, soldiers sent when summoned, hostages delivered as guarantees. In return, the Hittite monarch pledged protection and recognition. These agreements were sealed with terrifying oaths. One tablet invokes the gods to curse any traitor with famine, pestilence, and destruction of their lineage. To break faith with Hatti was not just political rebellion, it was cosmic treason. Yet alliances proved fragile. Vassal kings balanced survival between great powers. In Syria especially, the lure of Egypt was strong. When Egyptian envoys arrived promising gold and prestige, many cities turned coat. The Hittites responded with swift, brutal campaigns. Sieges, deportations, and public punishments meant to frighten others into obedience. Scholars still debate whether this constant cycle of revolt and repression drained Hittite resources beyond repair. Quirky glimpses of this diplomacy come from vassal correspondence. In one letter, a Syrian ruler pleads with his Hittite overlord to send grain, claiming famine has left his people starving. In another, a king requests a new bride from Hattusa's royal family to cement loyalty. Some letters even complain about the quality of gifts. One vassal grumbles that the silver he received was impure, a dangerous insult in a world where prestige was everything. Inside the empire itself, alliances were equally precarious. Rival factions within the royal family jockeyed for power, supported by different vassal states. Civil war erupted more than once, with brothers or nephews contesting the throne. Vassals exploited these moments of weakness, declaring independence or shifting allegiance to Egypt or Assyria. The very system that extended Hittite power also amplified its vulnerability. A particularly telling case was the city of Ugarit. Prosperous and cosmopolitan, it stood as a loyal Hittite ally for generations. Yet even Ugarit wavered when Assyrian strength rose in the east, quietly corresponding with new powers while still paying lip service to Hattusa. Scholars still debate whether such duplicity was betrayal or simply the pragmatism of survival in a dangerous world. Picture a Hittite envoy entering a vassal court, clay tablets tucked under his arm, armed guards at his side. He reads aloud the king's demands, invokes the wrath of the gods, and demands tribute. The local ruler bows, promises loyalty, and swears the oaths. Yet behind him, whispers already plot whether Egypt's gold or Assyria's might offer a better bargain tomorrow. In this dance of fragile alliances, the Hittite Empire expanded its reach far beyond Anatolia. But every oath carried the seeds of rebellion, every treaty the shadow of betrayal. For an empire built on promises, stability was always one broken vow away from collapse. Collapse begins. No empire falls in a single night. For the Hittites, decline crept in gradually, a whisper before the storm. By the late 13th century BCE, signs of strain were everywhere. Fields withering from drought, earthquakes shaking fortresses, rival empires rising to challenge, and the ever-present threat of rebellion simmering among vassals. What had once been a tightly woven web of power began to fray, strand by strand. One of the clearest signs comes from letters found in Ugarit. Around 1200 BCE, the city's king sent desperate pleas to his Hittite overlords for grain, reporting famine so severe that his people were starving. Similar letters in Hattusa speak of shipments requested from Egypt. These fragments reveal a region-wide food crisis, likely linked to shifting climate and crop failure. Scholars still debate whether drought was the spark that set the collapse in motion, or merely one factor among many. Earthquakes, too, left their scars. Anatolia lies on restless tectonic ground, and evidence of destruction, layers in several Hittite cities suggests seismic activity may have compounded the chaos. Imagine citadel walls cracking, temples toppling, storage jars shattering as the ground itself betrayed the empire. For people already weakened by hunger, the tremors would have seemed the wrath of the gods. Quirky records survive of frantic ritual responses. Texts describe kings leading ceremonies to appease angry deities, burying figurines, offering sacrifices, even sending scapegoats into the wilderness. One ritual calls for driving a sheep through the city gates to carry away evil. These were not theatrical acts, but desperate attempts to reset cosmic balance when the world seemed to unravel. Meanwhile, external pressures mounted. Assyria surged in the east, flexing military power once contained by Hittite diplomacy. In the west, restive Anatolian tribes Pus hid against imperial borders. In the south, Egypt remained vigilant. The Hittite kings now faced threats on every frontier, with fewer resources to meet them. At the very heart of the empire, unity cracked. Succession disputes tore the royal family, with rival claimants contesting the throne. Each civil conflict weakened central authority, leaving vassals freer to break away. Scholars still debate whether the Hittite collapse was primarily external invasion or internal implosion, but the evidence suggests both forces collided. Picture Hattusa in its twilight, warehouses half empty, scribes recording emergency grain shipments, soldiers grumbling over delayed pay. Priests chant louder at sanctuaries, pleading with gods who seem increasingly silent. Envoys return from Syria with grim news, rebellions, famines, encroaching enemies. The empire that once rivaled Egypt and signed the world's first peace treaty now fought a losing war against entropy itself. The decline had begun, slow and relentless, like cracks spreading through stone. The thunder of chariots still rolled across battlefields, but the ground beneath the Hittites was shifting, and soon it would give way entirely. Sea peoples arrive, as if famine, earthquakes, and rebellions were not enough. A new terror swept across the Mediterranean at the dawn of the 12th century BCE. They came not as one people, but as a confederation of marauders, displaced migrants, and war bands, the Sea Peoples. To later Egyptians, they were chaos incarnate, sweeping in from unknown western lands, burning cities, and toppling kingdoms. For the Hittites, already weakened, their arrival proved catastrophic. The coastal cities of Anatolia and Syria, many loyal to Hatti, bore the first blows. Archaeological layers at sites like Ugarit shows sudden destruction around 1190 BCE. Buildings burned, archives sealed in ash. In one haunting letter, the king of Ugarit pleads desperately for aid, warning that enemy ships have appeared and that his city cannot withstand them alone. No help arrived. The city fell, never to rise again. The sea peoples struck with terrifying efficiency. They were not merely raiders in swift ships, but organised forces, some with families and ox carts in tow, suggesting entire communities on the move. Scholars still debate their origins. Were they Aegean Greeks displaced by upheaval, Western Anatolians driven by famine, or a coalition of many? Whatever their source, their impact was undeniable. They overwhelmed the fragile coastal defences of the Hittite world. A quirky clue lies in Egyptian records. Ramses III, a century after Kadesh, carved his victory over the sea peoples at Medinet Habu. His reliefs depict feather-helmeted warriors, ships locked in battle, and prisoners dragged before the pharaoh. While Ramses boasted of triumph, the fact that he faced such an invasion at all shows the scale of the movement. The same waves that battered Egypt had already swept through Hittite vassals, leaving nothing but smoke. For the Hittites, the sea peoples were less a single decisive enemy than the final straw. Coastal ports fell, trade routes snapped, supplies of grain and tin were cut off. The empire, reliant on these arteries, starved. Letters from the late Hittite kings show desperation, begging allies for provisions. Some scholars suggest the sea peoples may have even reached central Anatolia, hastening the abandonment of Hattusa itself. Others argue their raids were limited to coasts, with famine and internal strife already dooming the heartland. The debate continues. Imagine the terror in a port like Ugarit. Watchmen spotting strange sails on the horizon, bells clanging, people rushing to hide clay tablets and treasures. Fires rise, screams echo, and by dawn silence falls. The archives remain buried under rubble, untouched until archaeologists uncovered them 3,000 years later. In those moments, the living memory of Hittite hegemony dissolved in smoke. The sea peoples did not conquer Hatti in the traditional sense. They did not march on Hattusa to raise their banners, but by severing its lifelines and scattering its allies, they ensured the empire's fragile body could no longer hold. The storm had broken fully, and the land of 1,000 gods was left gasping under waves of chaos. The vanishing act, and then, quite suddenly, the Hittites were gone. By the early 12th century BCE, the once mighty empire that had rivaled Egypt, commanded Syria, and signed the world's first peace treaty, had vanished from history's stage. Unlike Rome, which lingered for centuries in decline, or Egypt, whose monuments proclaimed continuity, the Hittites disappeared almost without farewell. At Hattusa, the sprawling capital, signs of abandonment tell the tale. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of fire sweeping through its temples and palaces, but not on the scale of total annihilation. Instead, the city seems to have been gradually deserted. Storerooms stood empty, archives left unrenewed, walls crumbling into silence. By 1180 BCE, the capital was no longer functioning as the beating heart of empire. Scholars still debate whether this was the result of direct invasion, internal revolt, or an orderly evacuation in the face of famine. The silence is haunting. After centuries of bureaucratic detail, laws, treaties, rituals, the records simply stop. One day the scribes pressed their styluses into wet clay, the next their tables lay cold and unused. No chronicler marked the last king's reign, no inscription lamented the fall. The Hittite Empire simply ceased to write itself. A quirky relic of this disappearance comes from the archives of Ugarit. There, amid letters begging for aid against invaders, a tablet was found half-baked in its kiln, abandoned mid-firing when the city was destroyed. It preserves the moment of collapse with eerie intimacy, an unfinished plea frozen for eternity, a human hand stilled by catastrophe. The end of Hatti was part of a wider unravelling. Across the Near East, empires fell, cities burned, and the great Bronze Age collapse reshaped the world. Yet the Hittites' vanishing act was more complete than most. Egypt survived, battered but intact. Assyria would soon rise stronger than ever. But the land of the Hittites receded into shadow, their name unspoken for 3,000 years. And so, for the Greeks who later sang of Troy, for the Persians who ruled Anatolia, for the Romans who marched across the same plateaus, the Hittites were not remembered as ancestors or rivals. They were forgotten entirely, buried beneath their own stones. Scholars still debate whether this oblivion was deliberate erasure by successors, or simply the accident of history, an empire whose memory had no heirs to carry it forward. Picture the last days of Hattusa, wind howling through empty streets, priests gone from sanctuaries, gates unguarded. The once proud lions carved into stone watched over silence, their jaws frozen mid-roar. Without scribes, without farmers, without kings, the empire evaporated into absence. Thus ended the Hittite Empire, not with a grand conquest remembered in legend, but with a quiet fading, a vanishing act so complete that for millennia no one even knew they had been. Echo in Assyria. Though the great empire of Hatti collapsed, the Hittites did not vanish entirely. In the centuries that followed, fragments of their culture flickered in what historians call the Neo-Hittite states, small kingdoms that clung to life in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Places like Carchemish, Melid, and Kumur became heirs of Hittite tradition, carrying forward their gods, their language, and their art even as larger powers crowded the stage. These Neo-Hittite states carved their inscriptions not in cuneiform, which had faded, but in hieroglyphic Luwian, the script once reserved for monuments. On basalt stelae and city gates, kings proclaimed their victories and lineage, echoing the grandeur of the old empire. Reliefs from Carchemish show warriors, feasting scenes, and processions of deities, continuity carved in stone. To stand before them today is to feel the stubborn persistence of a culture refusing to be erased. Yet they were no longer superpowers. Hemmed in by rising Assyria, these kingdoms became both buffer states and stepping stones in the march of empires. Some resisted fiercely, others submitted and paid tribute. Assyrian annals boast of conquering Hatti, though by then the term referred less to the vanished empire than to the patchwork of its descendants. Scholars still debate how much of Hittite identity truly endured. Were these Neo-Hittite states continuations of Hatti, or merely new polities borrowing its symbols? A quirky reminder of this persistence lies in the Assyrian court itself. Some Hittite craftsmen, deported after conquests, carried their skills into Mesopotamia. Their artistic style, winged creatures, lion guardians, intricate seals, left fingerprints on Assyrian art. Even in defeat, the Hittites shaped the visual language of their conquerors. Religion, too, endured. The storm god Teshub, known in the Old Empire, lived on in Neo-Hittite inscriptions and eventually merged with deities of the Aramaeans and Assyrians. In this way, Hittite gods became threads in the wider tapestry of Near Eastern religion. Scholars still debate whether echoes of these deities can be traced into later Greco-Roman traditions, their names blurred but their essence surviving. Imagine walking through Carchemish around 900 BCE. The walls bristle with new fortifications, markets bustle with traders from Phoenicia and Assyria, but on the gates stand reliefs of storm gods and lions unmistakably Hittite in style. Here, the memory of empire lived on, not as a distant past, but as a present identity, proclaimed proudly to all who entered. Yet time was against them. By the 8th century BCE, Assyria absorbed the last Neo-Hittite states, their kings dethroned, their cities annexed. The Hittite voice faded again, this time into the booming roar of Assyrian conquest. Still, these echoes matter. They remind us that while empires may fall, cultures rarely vanish completely. Instead, they ripple forward, absorbed, transformed, whispered in new tongues. In the shadow of Assyria, the Hittites endured a little longer, faint but not yet silent. Forgotten for millennia. After the Neo-Hittite states were absorbed into the expanding Assyrian Empire, the last living embers of Hittite culture dimmed. Over time, their names vanished from chronicles, their cities crumbled into the earth, and their gods merged with others, until no one remembered they had ever stood apart. The silence stretched so long and so deep that, for more than 2,000 years, the Hittites became one of history's greatest disappearances. In the classical world, the Hittites were scarcely mentioned. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote at length of Egypt, Persia, and Greece, but never named them. To the Greeks, the Anatolian highlands were lands of Phrygians, Lydians, and later Persians, not of Hittites. By then, even the ruins of Hattusa lay buried under centuries of soil, its lion gates staring at sheep instead of kings. Scholars still debate whether faint echoes of the Hittites lingered in legends of the Trojans or Anatolian heroes, but if so, their identity had already blurred beyond recognition. The Bible remained the only stubborn trace. There, the Hittites appear repeatedly, dwelling in Canaan, trading with the Israelites, even marrying into their families. Uriah the Hittite, loyal soldier of King David, is perhaps the most famous. Yet these biblical Hittites were not the empire builders of Anatolia, but smaller groups who may have been cultural remnants or unrelated peoples who shared the name. For centuries, this discrepancy puzzled theologians. Were the biblical Hittites a minor tribe or shadows of a lost empire? Quirky sermons and scholarly debates swirled around the mystery, but no one guessed the scale of what had truly been lost. By the Middle Ages, even those faint questions faded. Anatolia became the realm of Byzantines, Seljuks, and Ottomans, its ancient past forgotten beneath new civilizations. Travellers might stumble across great stones etched with strange symbols, but without context. They were curiosities at best. Local villagers used them as building blocks, their inscriptions no more meaningful than the pattern of veins in marble. This centuries-long oblivion remains astonishing. How could an empire that signed the world's first peace treaty, rivaled Ramses II, and ruled a vast domain vanish so thoroughly? Scholars still debate whether it was simply the accident of archaeology, their archives buried too well, their monuments too provincial, or whether their lack of cultural heirs sealed their fate. Unlike Egypt or Babylon, no later power claimed descent from the Hittites, no scribes preserved their names. Without continuity, memory broke. Imagine the Anatolian plateau in the year 1000 CE. Shepherds tend flocks across grassy hills, villages huddle against the wind. Beneath their feet lie the ruins of Hattusa, stones of palaces, fragments of tablets, the carved gods of Yazılıkaya. None know their names, none remember the kings who once thundered across the Levant. The empire sleeps, forgotten, while the world above spins on. And so, for millennia, the Hittites existed only as faint echoes in scripture, a puzzle without answer. They had not merely fallen, they had been erased from memory itself, awaiting the curious eyes of explorers to awaken them once more. Victorian surprises. It was the 19th century, the age of empires and railways, when Europe's scholars and explorers fanned out across the Near East in search of antiquity. They dug at Nineveh and uncovered Assyria, traced the stones of Babylon, and even sought the city of Troy. Yet, amid these quests, Anatolia held its own secret. Here, amid rugged hills and lonely villages, fragments of a forgotten power began to re-emerge, to the astonishment of Victorian eyes. Travellers told stories of strange ruins near the town of Boğazköy. Shepherds grazed their flocks across crumbling walls. Villagers carted away stones to build houses, and monumental lion statues watched silently from overgrown gates. In the 1830s, French explorer Charles Texier visited the site. What he saw stunned him. Vast ramparts, temples and gateways sprawled across the hills. He named it simply the Great City, though he had no idea who had built it. Meanwhile, in Syria, other Europeans stumbled upon mysterious inscriptions at Hamath, Aleppo and Carchemish. These symbols, resembling hieroglyphs but unlike any known script, were carefully copied and carried back to Europe. Scholars puzzled over them. Were they Phoenician, Lydian? Some fringe theorists even claimed they were remnants of a biblical tribe. For decades, the mystery deepened, tantalizing but unsolved. Scholars still debate whether the Victorians truly recognized the scale of what they had found, or whether they dismissed the ruins as provincial curiosities until later. A quirky episode unfolded in 1876 when Archibald Henry Sayce, a young British scholar, suggested that the enigmatic inscriptions might belong to the lost Hittites of the Bible. His proposal was bold, almost reckless, yet it proved prophetic. Sayce argued that these scattered stones and hieroglyphs were traces of a once great people erased from memory. At the time, many said him as fanciful, for the Hittites were still widely assumed to be minor tribal figures. The Victorian fascination with the Bible ensured the mystery gained traction. If the Hittites were more than a footnote, then here was confirmation of Scripture's historical depth. Adventurers and missionaries joined scholars in scouring Anatolia, sketching reliefs, and speculating wildly about their makers. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Hittites were becoming visible again, though faintly, like a ghost stirring in half-light. Imagine a drawing room in London around 1880. Scholars clustered around hand-copied sketches of lion gates and strange hieroglyphs, pipe smoke curling as debates raged. Were these ruins remnants of the Assyrians, or evidence of an unknown empire? Some scoffed, others leaned forward with fascination. The truth was not yet clear, but the seeds of rediscovery had been sown. By the end of the century, with the great excavations at Hattusa looming, it was clear the Victorians had stumbled upon something immense. The surprise was not merely that they had found ruins, but that those ruins hinted at a civilization equal to Egypt and Babylon, a civilization the world had entirely forgotten, language cracked. The ruins of Hattusa had yielded thousands of clay tablets, yet for years they sat mute. Scholars could copy their wedge-shaped signs, but the language within was unknown, a barrier between the living and the long-dead Hittite scribes. Akkadian, the lingua franca of diplomacy, could be read, but the strange native tongue of the kings of Hatti resisted every attempt. Then, in 1915, a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný made an announcement that would change history. Hrozný argued that the tablets were written in an Indo-European language related to Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. At first, the claim sounded outrageous. To connect a forgotten Anatolian empire to the linguistic ancestors of Europe seemed improbable. But Hrozný presented proof in the form of a simple, almost mundane sentence, Nu nindaan edzateni watama ekuteni. Now you will eat bread and drink water. Suddenly the language spoke, recognizable in its bones even across millennia. This breakthrough was seismic. The Hittite texts became not just decipherable, but revelatory. They pushed the history of Indo-European languages back 1,000 years earlier than anyone had imagined. Scholars still debate the implications. Was Hittite the first branch to split from the Indo-European tree, preserving archaic simplicity? Or was it a cousin shaped by centuries of contact with non-Indo-European tongues? Either way, it redefined our understanding of how languages spread and evolve. Quirky details emerged as the tablets were read. Bureaucratic records listed rations of bread, beer, and oil for palace staff. Myths told of storm gods battling dragons, echoing Greek legends. Diplomatic letters revealed queens writing directly to pharaohs. Suddenly the Hittites were no longer shadows. They were people, eating, praying, worrying, ruling. The decipherment also unlocked the enigmatic hieroglyphic Hittite inscriptions scattered across Anatolia. Once thought mere decoration, they turned out to be a related tongue, Luwian, carved into stone in the Neo-Hittite states. For the first time, those solemn lions and processions of gods spoke in words rather than silence. Yet puzzles remained. Scholars still debate how widespread literacy was among the Hittites. Were these texts the domain of a narrow scribal elite, or did merchants and soldiers also recognize signs? The sheer volume of tablets suggests a highly literate bureaucracy, but whether ordinary citizens shared this skill remains unknown. Imagine the moment in Hrozny's study, a clay fragment on the desk, light slanting across the wedge-shaped signs. As he traced the sentence aloud, hearing familiar words in an unfamiliar tongue, he must have felt the past tilt and rearrange itself. After 3,000 years of silence, the Hittites spoke again, not in whispers, but in the clear syllables of bread and water. In cracking their language, scholars gave back the Hittites their voice. No longer a nameless ruin, they could tell their own story, and from that moment the forgotten empire began to step out of the shadows, its words echoing once more across history. Modern excavations. The 20th century brought a new era of discovery, as archaeologists turned Hattusa from a rumour in stone into a window on an empire. German teams, beginning with Hugo Winkler and carried on by successive generations, dug deeper into the Anatolian earth, revealing temples, palaces, and entire city plans. What emerged was staggering. Hattusa was not a provincial stronghold, but a sprawling capital, its walls snaking 6 kilometers across rocky hills, its gates adorned with lions, sphinxes, and warriors in relief. The excavations uncovered not only grandeur, but also daily rhythm. Temples dedicated to the storm god and sun goddess stood at the heart of the city, surrounded by storerooms that once brimmed with grain and oil. Palatial archives held tens of thousands of clay tablets, stacked like ancient filing cabinets. Residential quarters revealed courtyards, hearths, and wells, reminding us that behind the myths and treaties lived families, scribes, and servants. One quirky find stopped even seasoned archaeologists in their tracks. A ritual pit filled with hundreds of small figurines, animals, and offerings, buried deliberately as part of some forgotten ceremony. Were they tokens of thanks, prayers for fertility, or remnants of a magical rite? Scholars still debate the meaning, their silence as eloquent as their survival. Beyond Hattusa, other sites enriched the picture. At Yazılıkaya, the rock sanctuary just outside the city, archaeologists traced the long procession of gods in clearer detail, realizing that the site may have served not just as a temple, but as a cosmic calendar. At Alakahoyuk, earlier layers revealed treasures of pre-Hittite culture, golden ornaments and ritual standards that may have inspired Hittite religious practices. Each excavation added another layer to the story, blending deep time with imperial ambition. Modern methods add nuance. Aerial photography mapped the extent of fortifications, geophysical surveys revealed buried streets without turning a spade, and dendrochronology, tree ring dating, offered glimpses into ancient climate. These techniques suggested that the late empire faced decades of drought, giving context to the famines described in desperate letters. Scholars still debate whether environmental crisis was the true nail in the coffin, or simply the trigger that exposed deeper fractures. Excavations also showed the Hittites' skill in engineering. Their massive city gates combined defensive strength with symbolic power, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, all guardians carved in stone, blending practical fortification with mythic resonance. Even the city's water supply was advanced, with tunnels and cisterns ensuring survival in siege. Imagine standing in Hattusa today, the wind sweeping across high plateaus, ruined walls tracing vast arcs across the hills, and beneath your feet, the echo of thousands of footsteps long gone. Tourists walk where kings once processed, where scribes carried tablets, where children played in courtyards. The stones whisper still, their silence broken only by the wind and the voices of archaeologists translating their story. Through modern excavation, the Hittites stepped firmly into the light. No longer a biblical puzzle or a fringe curiosity, they became flesh and blood builders of empire, their capital laid bare stone by stone. And yet, each new trench reminds us, for all we know, much still waits beneath the Anatolian soil, keeping the empire's final secrets, artifacts and echoes. The Hittites left behind more than walls and temples. Scattered across Anatolia and the Levant are the artifacts of their world, small, intimate echoes that bridge the gulf of 3,000 years. Each seal, relief and vessel whispers, fragments of a story too large to hold in memory, yet too vivid to be silenced. Foremost among these are the seals. Hittite officials, kings and queens, pressed their authority into clay with intricate stamp or cylinder seals. Many bore images of lions, winged creatures or storm gods, alongside names written in hieroglyphic or cuneiform. These seals served practical purposes, authenticating documents and cargoes, but they also carried symbolism. To hold one today is to feel the weight of identity in a palm-sized object, authority compacted into stone. Quirky examples even include seals with playful motifs like rabbits or birds, suggesting that not all power was expressed in solemnity. Reliefs carved into stone outcrops endure as public statements of kingship. At Yazılıkaya, gods march in orderly lines. At Ivriz, a later Neo-Hittite carving shows a king pouring water for a fertility god, grain and vines blooming around them. These images tethered rulers to divine favour, reminding both subjects and gods of their sacred duties. Scholars still debate whether these reliefs were primarily for human eyes or for the deities themselves. Carved prayers left exposed to wind and sky. Tablets, too, remain the richest echo. Beyond myths and treaties, countless routine records survive. Lists of sheep, inventories of temple goods, receipts for grain. One quirky tablet preserves a lawsuit over stolen bees, a tiny drama of Bronze Age daily life. Such fragments make the Hittites tangible, not only kings and queens, but neighbours quarrelling over hives. Weapons and tools reveal their craftsmanship. Bronze daggers, often inlaid with zagged ardis. Ilva blend utility with beauty. Chariot fittings gleam with traces of copper and gold, testaments to the pride invested in warfare. Household pottery, plain and sturdy, shows the rhythm of daily meals. Scholars still debate whether distinct regional styles in pottery mark cultural diversity within the empire or simple variations in local tradition. The Hittites also left echoes in others' stories. Egyptian reliefs of Kadesh depict their chariots. Assyrian annals record wars against the land of Hatti. Even Greek myth may preserve shadows of Hittite legend. The storm god battling serpents, divine succession myths, or Anatolian tales later woven into Homeric epic. The echoes are faint, yet they ripple across traditions, suggesting the Hittites left fingerprints beyond their borders. Imagine standing in a museum case, peering at a small clay tablet. Its lines are dense, pressed with a reed stylus 3,000 years ago by a scribe whose name is lost. It may record rations of beer or a prayer for rain. To us, it is an artifact. To him, it was simply work, a daily task in a living world. Through these fragile remnants, the Hittites speak again, not in thunder, but in murmurs, mundane, sacred, and utterly human. Artifacts are not the empire itself, but they are its echoes, and together they reconstruct a chorus that reminds us that even forgotten giants leave traces, waiting patiently for rediscovery. Historians' puzzles. For all the tablets translated and ruins uncovered, the Hittites remain, in many ways, an enigma. Historians have pieced together their wars, treaties, and rituals, but fundamental questions still circle them like unanswered riddles. Who were they at heart? Pioneers, imitators, or pragmatists who borrowed from neighbours to survive? Some scholars argue the Hittites were innovators. They perfected the heavy three-man chariot, codified laws that emphasized restitution over revenge, and created the world's first surviving peace treaty. Their archives show meticulous record-keeping and treaties that resemble modern international law. In this view, they were trailblazers of governance and diplomacy, centuries ahead of their time. Others emphasize their role as synthesizers. Their religion was a collage, pulling in deities from Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Hurrian highlands. Their myths echo Mesopotamian epics and prefigure Greek legends. Even their writing systems, cuneiform borrowed from Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs adapted for Anatolia, suggest a talent for adopting and adapting rather than creating from scratch. Scholars still debate whether their genius lay in invention or in weaving diverse traditions into a durable fabric. A quirky puzzle lies in their disappearance. Unlike Egypt or Babylon, the Hittites left no continuous legacy in later cultures. Their ruins vanished beneath earth, their language fell silent, their name barely survived in the Bible. Why? Some argue that without monumental stone architecture on the scale of pyramids or ziggurats, their memory simply eroded. Others propose that because no later empire claimed descent from them, their legacy had no champion. Still others whisper that rivals deliberately erased them. The debate continues. Another unresolved mystery involves their role in the Bronze Age collapse. Did they fall primarily to climate change, famine, or invasion? Were internal fractures decisive? Each new excavation adds pieces but rarely certainty. Some evidence points to drought spanning decades. Other finds suggest invasions by the Sea Peoples dealt the final blow. Scholars still debate whether the Hittites were victims of circumstance or architects of their own downfall. Even their social fabric puzzles us. Were women truly more empowered in Hatti than elsewhere? Or do the prominence of queens like Puduhepa reflect exceptions? Did ordinary villagers feel loyalty to the empire or merely obedience? With so much of the record drawn from elite scribes, the voices of commoners are largely silent, leaving historians to speculate. Imagine a round table today, scholars gathered with laptops and ancient fragments side by side. Some argue passionately for the Hittites as innovators, others shake their heads and point to borrowed myths. Each tablet becomes evidence, each excavation a new clue in an endless debate. The Hittites, silent for millennia, now live again, not only in stone and clay, but in the arguments of those who study them. Their puzzles remain unsolved, but perhaps that is fitting. An empire once erased from memory now endures as a riddle that keeps historians awake at night, a reminder that history is less a completed script than an ongoing conversation with the past. Why erased? The fall of Hatti was dramatic, but its forgetting was even more profound. Egypt left pyramids, Greece epics, Babylon ziggurats. The Hittites left walls, tablets and sanctuaries, but somehow their name still slipped away for 3,000 years. Why were they erased so thoroughly? Some argue it was simply accident. Their capital sat far inland, away from Mediterranean trade routes that later civilizations favoured. When Hattusa fell silent, no chroniclers came to see. The land was resettled by Phrygians, Lydians, Persians, each layering their own culture over the ruins. Without successors to remember them, the Hittites faded into soil and stone. Others suggest rival powers buried them deliberately. Assyria, inheriting the lands of the Neo-Hittite states, may have had little interest in preserving the legacy of a rival. Egypt, in its triumphal inscriptions, portrayed itself as unchallenged, downplaying the memory of the formidable empire it once faced at Kadesh. In a world where history was propaganda, silence could be as sharp as conquest. Scholars still debate whether the Hittites were victims of active erasure or passive neglect. A quirky clue lies in the Bible's portrayal. The Hittites appear there, but only as minor figures, traders, neighbours, or warriors of small renown. Could it be that Israelite scribes preserved the name, but not the empire behind it? If so, then even as late as the Iron Age, the grandeur of Hatti was already forgotten, its people reduced to a shadow tribe. Architecture may also explain their erasure. Unlike Egypt's towering pyramids or Mesopotamia's brick ziggurats, Hittite monuments were less colossal. Their fortresses of stone crumbled into hillsides, their temples eroded into rubble. Yazılıkaya survived, but only as enigmatic carvings until decipherment. Their legacy lacked the overwhelming presence that forces memory to endure, and yet erasure is never complete. Villagers in Anatolia lived among lion gates, carved stones, and strange hieroglyphs, using them as house foundations or curiosity pieces. The ruins never entirely vanished. They simply became mute. Only when European eyes returned in the 19th century did the silent stones begin to speak again. Imagine the ghost of a Hittite king, watching centuries pass as Persians, Romans, and Turks marched across his old capital. His gates are still there, his gods still carved in rock, but no one remembers his name. The empire's greatness lingers only in stone lions staring blindly at sheep. The Hittites' erasure teaches us something unsettling. Memory in history is not guaranteed. It depends on successors, storytellers, monuments that withstand time. Without them, even giants can vanish. Their silence was not just the result of collapse, but of a world that moved on without remembering. And so, when the Hittites re-emerged in the modern age, it felt less like discovering a lost chapter and more like uncovering an entire book torn from the library of humanity. Legacy remembered. Today, the Hittites no longer sleep beneath obscurity. Thanks to archaeology, linguistics, and patient scholarship, they stand once more among the great civilizations of the ancient world. Their ruins at Hattusa are UNESCO heritage, their peace treaty with Egypt displayed at the United Nations, their myths compared alongside Mesopotamian epics and Greek legends. The empire erased has become an empire remembered. Their legacy lies in diplomacy. The Treaty of Kadesh remains the earliest surviving example of written international law, a model of negotiated peace in a world of conquest. It shows that even in the Bronze Age, rulers recognized the futility of endless war and sought stability through compromise. In this, the Hittites offer a precedent as relevant to our own era as to theirs. Their legacy lies also in language. By preserving their words in clay, the Hittites gave modern linguists the key to Indo-Europeans' deep past. Every student of Greek, Latin, or Sanskrit now traces their ancestry back through Hittite, hearing echoes of their syntax in phrases first scratched onto tablets 3.5 millennia ago. Scholars still debate whether Hittite represents the root or an early branch of the family, but either way, it anchors the story of how languages travelled and transformed. Their religion and myth ripple outward too. The storm god's battle with the serpent Illuyanka resonates with Greek Zeus, Norse Thor, even biblical Yahweh's contest with Leviathan. These shared patterns remind us that the Hittites were not isolated, but part of a vast cultural conversation spanning continents. Even in art and engineering, their fingerprints endure. Their fortifications influenced later Anatolian builders. Their relief style echoes in Neo-Hittite and Assyrian sculpture. Quirky survivals include the Kikali text on horse training, a manual that equester irons today can still recognize in its rhythms of feeding and exercise. Few other ancient peoples left us such a practical guide across millennia. Most importantly, their legacy is a cautionary tale. For centuries, the Hittites stood shoulder to shoulder with Egypt and Babylon, yet their name slipped entirely from memory. They remind us that greatness offers no guarantee of remembrance. Without continuity, without storytellers, even the most powerful can vanish into silence. Scholars still debate whether we should see them as innovators, imitators, or pragmatic survivors, but all agree their erasure was one of history's strangest injustices. Imagine standing at the Lion Gate of Hattusa today. Tourists shuffle past, cameras clicking, wind curling over the plateau. The lions, carved more than 3,000 years ago, still bare their teeth. They have seen empires rise and fall, religions born and forgotten, languages spoken and lost. Now, at last, the world remembers their makers. The Hittites, once erased, have been restored to memory, not as faint shadows, but as giants whose voices, myths, and laws still echo in our shared human story. Conclusion. The Hittite Empire was once a titan of the Bronze Age, a realm of chariots and treaties, gods carved into rock and laws pressed into clay. It rose from uncertain origins to rival Egypt, only to collapse into silence so profound that for 3 millennia the world forgot it had ever lived. Rediscovered through ruins and language, the Hittites now stand revealed not just as warriors and rulers, but as storytellers, builders, and diplomats whose legacy still shapes how we understand civilization itself. Their story is more than history, it is a reminder. Memory is fragile. Without voices to carry it, even empires vanish. And yet, through persistence and rediscovery, forgotten giants can rise again, whispering across the centuries to remind us that nothing, once written in stone or clay, is ever truly gone,